Okay, we'll start in just a moment. I see a few people's audios are still connecting. Great. Okay, let us get started. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Holly Morikami, BOMA Hawaii's 2020 president, as well as today's moderator for our webinar with Premier Restoration Hawaii. A couple of quick housekeeping items. Before we begin, we have everyone placed on mute and we'll be accepting questions during the presentation. Should you have any questions, please type them in the Zoom chat room. A special thank you to our August Platinum sponsor, Premier Restoration Hawaii, for taking the time to put together this relevant and timely content for our BOMA Hawaii members and friends. Also, a special mahalo to you all, our BOMA Hawaii members and friends, for being a part of today's virtual lunch and learn. As a special mahalo from Premier Hawaii, they are giving participants a free Tori Richards face mask and hand sanitizer. And if you haven't seen the Tori Richard masks or tried them on, they're very comfy. So please email Kira at KERA@premierhi.com and she'll coordinate getting that to you. Our next virtual event is Wednesday, August 26th at 12 p.m. Our panelists will be providing a 2020 legislative recap with a focus on those bills impacting commercial real estate. The program is being brought to you all in partnership with CCIM. Please visit bomahawaii.com for more information. Without further ado, I'm pleased to present Premier Restoration Hawaii's webinar entitled Indoor Air Quality, Addressing Pollutant Sources and Solutions to Protect the Air We Breathe, and introduce you to our speakers. Our speakers today are Anthony Nelson, Senior Vice President of Statewide Operations and Certifications at Premier Restoration Hawaii. He is a technician in the areas of applied microbial remediation, applied structural drying, carpet cleaning, repair, reinstallation, color repair, commercial drying, fire and smoke restoration, health and safety, odor control, and water damage restoration. He is also a resilient flooring inspector. Our second speaker is Brad Caddick. He's a senior managing consultant at Rambo, an engineering, architecture, and consultancy organization with 130 offices in 28 countries. He has more than 15 years of experience in industrial hygiene and environmental consulting, with a special emphasis in microbial growth investigations, remediation design, indoor environmental quality assessments, and occupational exposure assessments. He also has extensive experience with building investigations and remediation of water damage, mold, and other microbial contamination issues. Brad has developed remediation plans for large, complex real estate holdings for highly specialized healthcare facilities. He has also provided expert witness testimony in matters involving indoor air quality in buildings, forensic analysis, and microbial contamination. He is a certified safety professional, certified air sampling professional, a specialist project manager, an inspector, and a mode inspector. Thank you, Anthony and Brad, for being here today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
All right, we'll go ahead and get started. So our topic today is going to be indoor air quality. We're going to look at 5 different areas that Brad and I kind of looked at and said, hey, these are good places to start conversation. But the way that this works best is as interactive as possible. And I know that's challenging because we're all sitting apart. But I would encourage everybody who's here today to, take the time. If we're talking about a topic and you've got a question, put it in the chat. I've got the chat window open right here, and we'll pause our dialogue back and forth to make sure that we answer your question. Because if it's just me and Brad's voices, it'll drone on. It'll probably get far too technical because that's the stuff we enjoy. Right. So a little bit about me. Thank you so much for the introduction, Holly. I think you covered everything. Kind of the key things to know about me. This is all I've ever done. I'm 38, so I'm kind of a young guy, but I've been in property restoration my entire life and half of that has been spent here in Hawaii. The other thing that is important to know about me is I'm very, very passionate about the technical side of what we do. So much so that I did something kind of crazy that I'll show you guys a quick video on real quick.
The reason why I flooded my home was because my company, Premier Restoration, had tripled in size in the past 3 years. That growth had created a need for training. It's unfortunate, but we do not have a flood school to supply that training here, so we created our own. I was very excited, like I was almost giddy. I'm going to flood it. I'm going to get to hang out with these guys that I've grown with and mentored, and we're going to learn so much together. And then it comes to the night before, and I'm walking this garden hose into my house and turning it on, and instantly the feeling of what the hell are you doing? While the only thing that was different was that this was my house, everything else was the same. You know, we were going to use the same equipment, the same guys that I would trust in anybody else's house. They're going to come in and they're going to dry my house.
So, yeah, I'm the guy that flooded his own house, so then that way we could have a playground to learn and understand more about what we do. And with that, I'll hand it over to Brad so he can just talk a little bit about himself.
Well, I've never flooded my own house or exposed any of my kids or wife to toxic chemicals yet. But no, I have over 20 years of experience in consulting. I've kind of like Anthony, I had a very brief stint in a laboratory right out of college, and then I spent the rest of my career doing consulting work. I've consulted in, oh man, I think 15 different countries. So very familiar with travel in different communities. And really my passion or my goal is to help people that have problems, solve those problems. And, you know, I probably heard you were great to work with. I never want to see you again. I don't take offense to that, but that means I did something right for somebody. So that's kind of where I am at. I ramble in one form or another has been in consulting in Hawaii for over 15 years now, primarily in the hospitality industry. We do a lot of work for hotel owners. We do a lot of due diligence for hotel owners. We also assist asset managers with property conditions and do consulting work during renovations. So that's the Hawaii connection. So I'll hand it back over to you, Anthony.
All right. First thing we want to talk about today is asbestos. And so I know everybody in here is in property, so I'm not going to drone on a ton on what exactly asbestos is. But I think the one thing that's important to know about asbestos is it is all natural. It comes out of the ground, and it's commonly found in building products pre-1980. However, that's just commonly. I will say, a colleague of mine in California did some sampling for some drywall mud that you can purchase off the shelf in Home Depot, and you can still buy mud off the shelf from Home Depot today that has trace amounts of asbestos in it. So that's important to know. I know a lot of you guys have newer buildings, but it's always good to double check. And the exposure concern is associated with respiratory issues. So a majority of what we're concerned about regarding asbestos is making sure that we're not breathing it. Do you have anything to add, Brad?
Yeah, I mean, I would add that be very cautious of what building materials you allow to be installed into buildings. As Anthony said, you can still find plenty of building materials, floor tiling, some type of mastic, joint compound that can be installed in buildings. So I advise my clients to get the safety data sheets if possible on any building material, or if a general contractor is doing a build out or whatnot in your building, to have them basically sign off or guarantee that they're not using any building materials that contain asbestos.
And then here, this is a helpful infographic that kind of has a number of different sources that you can find asbestos in homes, and in this even transfers over to businesses and commercial spaces. You know, a lot of the folks that we talk to are like, oh, I don't have asbestos containing floor tile, but the reality is it can be in just about any building material. And there are, you know, with floor tile, it's usually, you know, 9x9 tiles historically tended to be asbestos containing, and 12x12 tiles historically tended to not be, but you can find asbestos in both 9x9 and 12x12 tiles. But there are other things that you can look for to see what you should be sampling. And I'll let Brad answer kind of some of the key things. If you were looking for something in modern buildings built past 1990, what materials would you be concerned about?
Floor tiles where I'd start. Roofing materials would be the second thing. You know, and I guess we should point out, just because you have asbestos doesn't mean you have to do anything about it, or it's a major concern. Most times, if it's in good condition or non-friable state, it's going to pose little to no harm or exposure to occupants. So, you know, just because the material does have ACM doesn't mean it has to be removed. But in a new building, usually you're going to find it in floor tile, mastic, and or roofing materials. And sometimes
any concerns with drywall in newer buildings?
You know, I've seen it in joint compound, but at such low levels that usually that only becomes an OSHA issue as opposed to more of a disposal or EPA or DOT issue.
Okay, cool. I get the reason I ask you, I get that question quite a bit.
Mm-hmm.
And how or when or how should you test for asbestos? So a lot of the testing slides, I'm going to defer to Brad and his expertise. A lot of the times we get asked these questions, and I'm always very keen to call Brad or one of our other indoor air quality partners to ask the questions on when we should test. So when and how should we test for asbestos, Brad?
Well, my underlying kind of environmental joke, which is pretty bad if you ask me, is you only test when the operations and maintenance program or your O&M program tells you to, which 90 to 95% of all buildings don't have, but they're, according to the EPA, should have. So basically that manual tells you, you know, is a owner's manual of where all the asbestos is located in their building and in what condition. And then if the condition changes, you're to test or take action. But like I said, most people don't have that manual. So when you start testing is if you are going to disturb it. If you're going to do a renovation and you don't know or you suspect, you have to test to confirm one way or the other if it is asbestos. So most of that testing will be bulk testing. You'll take a sample of the material itself and submit it to a laboratory, and you know, the key number is 1%. If it's considered 1% or more, it's asbestos containing building material. Less than 1%, but still some percentage, 0.5 or something along those lines, that would be considered a non-asbestos building material. But then you still have the OSHA regulations where OSHA states they don't care what percentage it is. If there's any part or percentage of asbestos in the building material, it has to be, your workers have to be protected if they're going to disturb it. And then, you know, how many samples? This can get tricky and very expensive very fast, depending on how big of a project you're going to do. But it's typically at least 3 bulk samples of the same building material on each floor. So if you have, you know, 20 suspect building materials in one room, you need at least 3 samples of each one of those 20 building materials that have to be sampled. And that number could go up to 5 to 7 of the same building material, depending on the size of the project. You know, some school projects or some major, big, large buildings, it's not uncommon to do 7 samples of one building material on each floor or each area as defined by the regulations. And then lastly, it's really never ever recommended to do air sampling at any point except for after an abatement project. Just doing a random air sample can give you some false positives of, you know, what are you comparing it to? Are you comparing it to the PEL? And why are you doing the air sampling? And those are very good questions that legal terms and legal people like to get involved in. So my recommendation would be to really consider why you're doing an air sample for asbestos. And if you get pushed on that by a tenant or whatnot, I would really consider doing a thorough inspection of the space and have someone document what those materials look like and provide that documentation before doing an air sample.
Right, you concerned about false elevated readings when you're doing that?
Well, just simply because asbestos can be found in so many other building materials and or mechanical materials, such as brake pads and stuff like that. So yeah, that, and then the other thing is what regulation are you going to follow? And how are you going to collect it? Are you going to collect it using PCM or TEM? What analysis are you going to use? Because, you know, if you get 5 fibers in an air sample, what does that mean? There's an asbestos in the air, but to what degree? So it can get a little tricky.
Yeah. And I'll just speaking from the less than 1% asbestos containing material. For us, like as abatement contractors, that tends to be a sticky situation because there are others in the marketplace who, once they see less than 1%, will say it is not asbestos containing, and then will proceed with just general demolition and general disposal. From an abatement perspective for us and the way that the regulations are written, the only thing that changes for us is that we don't have to do manifest disposal of that material. We still have to put on the appropriate PPE. We still want to erect critical barriers. And we are not required to do that for I guess technically for the safety of others. I'm doing it for the safety and liability protection of our organization and for the safety of the individuals who work for us. So then that way I can make sure that when they're in there and they're disturbing those materials, they're not taking any of that material home with them in their vehicles and to their families.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the whole OSHA regulation.
Yeah. All right. When should you notify the Department of Health? The Department of Health does have a fact sheet available, so the State of Hawaii Department of Health. And simply put, what they're saying is all demolition projects, including facilities for which no asbestos is present. And I think that that's kind of important, particularly when we start talking about newer infrastructure being taken down, which happens quite a bit in the downtown area. What our community needs does tend to change rapidly, particularly like in Kaka'ako, right? We see things getting knocked down and put back up all the time. And then they do have specific square and linear and cubic footages for renovation projects. The one that we tend to look at quite a bit is we do run into a ton of drywall that is asbestos containing, and the notification requirement on drywall is pretty low. So I know a majority of our customers, when we tell them, hey, look, we need 10 days to do the appropriate DOH notification, that can sometimes be hard to swallow because typically, it's an emergency situation. You either had a flood or a fire and you want me to get in there and you want me to do this work right away, but we're kind of handcuffed a little bit to that 10-day notification. And then any planned renovation operations. So if you have facility operations that are ongoing through the year, they have a notification requirement for that. Anything to add, Brad?
No, that's pretty straightforward.
Yeah.
I guess
And if any, go ahead.
you could get an emergency junction if needed. I know they don't like to hand those out, but if it is like a flood and you notify the Department of Health right away, I mean, you could get a an emergency work permit, I think, right?
Yeah, we can, and usually what they're looking for is, you know, the argument that somebody's displaced kind of doesn't carry a ton of weight, because, you know, we could have an entire condo or a floor of a condo building or a commercial space that is completely burned out. What they typically want to see is not only that somebody's displaced, but also that we have the ability to put them back together quicker and eliminate any sort of hardship. You know, so when you're talking about wanting to do demolition on an entire floor of a building, you're talking of a construction project that takes months. Whereas if it's just, you know, 200 square feet of somebody's ceiling, typically those are the type of projects where they'll give that emergency, they'll allow you to do that emergency notification and start right away. All right, and then here's kind of the standards that exist around it. Brad, you wanna review them?
Sure. So we talked about OSHA. OSHA is very, their only concern really is the worker itself. So whether it be your employees, so if you have an engineer or whatnot, and they're going to disturb asbestos, you know, they have to be trained. Some they can do a little bit of work here and there every year under the O&M. The EPA is obviously the one that set forth some of these regulations way back when, and then really the other one that you're going to live with day in and day out is the Department of Health in the state of Hawaii.
And what I always find, and I'm not, you know, if any of our Department of Health or EPA guys are on the call today, please don't take offense at this, but the one thing that I'm always trying to manage is that the fact that what each of these agencies or standards is asking of us to do is representing a specific interest. So like OSHA is obviously representing worker health and safety, whereas the EPA is more general population. And sometimes the language between those two standards can, I don't want to say conflict, but they send you running in different directions. And so you're a lot of the times you got to be very specific to make sure that you're addressing the concerns of both. And then some, you know, we get a lot of phone calls like, hey, I have asbestos in my property. It's not, you know, it's not friable, or it may or may not be a problem. How can I just straight up, how can I save some money? So one of the things that we're always keen to recommend, particularly with items like pipe wrap, is encapsulating. Encapsulating is just kind of a fancy word for paint, but what it'll do is if you have some pipe wrap that's in relatively good condition and you encapsulate it, it'll take any fibers that have the potential to become friable and seal them in. You can also do a method of encapsulating with tile floors, given that the integrity of the tile floors is still there. Those are the two images that you see at the top. And then kind of number one for me as a restoration guy, we can dry a lot of stuff, and we can dry a lot of stuff without disturbing it. And so a lot of the times why we have to remove building materials that are asbestos containing has nothing to do with the fact that they actually contain asbestos, and it has everything to do with the fact that we were not able to, or we did not receive the phone call early enough on in the process to respond to be able to save that material. And so whenever anybody who's a property manager and asset manager asks me from my perspective, what's the big piece of advice? Call fast, call now, call right away, because if we can get there quick, there's a lot of things that we can save. Anything to add, Brad?
No, that's good.
Right on. All right, next we're going to talk about lead. This is a slide on where we can find sources of lead in the environment. You know, more commonly, everybody associates lead-containing materials with paint, but it can kind of come from a number of different places. And I'm sure, Brad, you've probably got a story or two about lead in the indoor environment that didn't come from paint?
Yeah, well, I think one of the ones you're missing is lead-lined water pipes, which, you know, obviously has been very prevalent in the media prior to COVID in Michigan and some other states where they've had some major issues with lead in drinking water. But also lead-lined walls in hospitals cause a lot of problems, especially when there's a leak, a flood, or a water event, when you have someone who just starts cutting open a wall without knowing so. So those are my fun experiences or comments.
Yeah, I remember when I was this was probably 2003, when I was a water damage restoration technician. The first time I had to dry a dentist office, my supervisor at the time called me and he was like, "You ask them if there's an x-ray machine there." And I didn't know why at the time until he explained why. And I was like, oh my gosh, I'm so glad I just didn't do what I normally would have done and walk in here and start drilling holes. When should we be testing for lead?
It's not that much different than asbestos. You know, whenever you're going to renovate, if you don't know for sure that your painted walls or wherever you're going to renovate, if it's unknown, then you should test for lead-based paint. And testing for lead-based paint can be done on a very fast method. There's a direct reading instruments that can be used, an XRF gun. So it's a little bit easier than, you know, waiting for laboratory results. Anytime, you know, something is damaged or disturbed or altered, known lead-based paint or paint that you think may be lead-based paint, sample the paint, and then also it's very important to sample areas around it, dust, or, you know, to get an idea of how bad the contamination may or may not have been. Recently, in the last 2 years or so, our company's done thousands upon thousands of drinking water samples for lead. And that, like I said, Flint, Michigan was kind of the eye opener. We have actually been doing lead and water for 20 years or so. But yeah, that can be a very big issue, especially in, as I said, the next bullet point, in pipes or stagnant water or water fountains that just aren't being used but are still operational. You would be surprised at some of the levels that you'll see, lead levels you'll see in that water. So recommendation would be, one, either get it tested, or two, just take it out of service and let people use the bottle fillers and bottled waters, but hopefully bottle fillers first.
Is there any particular time frame of construction that you tend to see more lead-lined pipes than less? Like, I know that's a general question, but I can already hear people going, "Oh crap, my building's old. Do I have an issue?"
Yeah, I mean, if you're getting, you know, pre-1990, you're suspect with some pipes, and it also depends on the city and location. But the other problem is you still have some of these faucets that are produced or manufactured in foreign countries that may have some lead soldering, or you may have soldered joints in the line itself where the line is not lead, but the solder is.
And how do you guys test for that? You just take a sample of the water, or?
Yeah, so the method that we commonly use is you take two samples. You take one, which we call a first draw sample. So put the container right underneath the faucet or whatnot, open the cold water, take a sample, and then you allow about 30 seconds of that water to run and take another sample.
Okay, cool. I was just taking a sip. I'm like, I hope there's no lead in my water, man.
Hopefully you're fine.
Oh, let's jump the slide. So DOH does have some notification requirements, and so like asbestos, they do have a fact sheet online. Whereas asbestos they're very specific. The projects requiring notification side of that fact sheet is a little more vague. And I don't know, do you have any color to add to this, Brad? I know, DOH, I can just tell you from our perspective, we've seen a little more, in the past 2 years, we've seen way more enforcement from DOH on the lead abatement side of our business. They've always been pretty consistent on the asbestos abatement side, but more recently it's been the lead side that we get more people showing up on our job sites when we send those notifications in. I think it's more of a concern for DOH right now than it has been previously. I'm not sure if you had anything to add.
No, I mean, I think you're probably, depending on what happens in November, you may see more federal regulations come down on this, but we'll see.
Okay, that's fair. I know there was some, we had somebody that was pretty hot to trot about just before the last election cycle, and that seemed to fade away. So yeah. All right. Probably the hardest part of the lead side of the equation to understand is what the inclusion of what's called the RRP rule. And even I get lost in this, and you'll catch me, speed dialing Brad or asking Joe, who's our abatement C19 holder. Hey, when does it qualify for RRP versus when does it become a full-blown abatement project? So I'll hand it over to you, Brad, and then I'll give my my layperson's explanation.
I hate this rule, to be honest with you. My advice going through this is just do it as an abatement project. I've seen way too many citations, fines, and whatnot to owners and contractors and those involved in these projects using this rule. It's just too hard and complicated, in my opinion.
And I'll tell you, so Premier Restoration, we are lead safe certified from the EPA with the RRP. So we have both. We have both lead abatement trained technicians, and then we also have several individuals who have the RRP designation as well. And so I think if you go back to intent, what the EPA was trying to do is they were looking at it and they were saying, all right, the reality of it is that abatement's not occurring when it should. And a lot of the lead-based surfaces that are getting disturbed by renovators, painters, folks like us. And they said, what can we do? What sort of regulation can we build around this that doesn't stall things and create undue hardship for people to get work done on their homes, but also provides protection for the general public. And so they created this RRP rule. So if you want to go get your RRP certification, it's a day-long class. And essentially they have some record keeping requirements that you have to maintain, but they're pretty loose. And I'll tell you, even the guy I was referencing on the last slide, we got audited at one point, and kind of what I understood to be our record keeping requirements and what that individual from the EPA was asking for from us were two different things. And so I don't know that there's a ton of clarity around it, but know that this is an option for general renovation. But like Brad said, we tend to default whenever somebody specifically calls us for anything lead containing. We do tend to push towards the abatement side because the rules are much more clear. Whereas if somebody's calling us for just a general water damage, fire restoration, normal lines of work, we'll historically treat those as RRP unless there's a concern or testing indicates otherwise. Anything else to add?
No, it's really tricky for you guys for the worker side.
It is, it definitely is. And I think the only thing, from a standard side, I have a ton of concerns, but as a a business operator with 150 employees, I kind of look at my primary responsibility is to my employees and making sure that they go home safe. And the one thing that gives me peace of mind about lead is that it doesn't remain in suspension near as long as an asbestos fiber. And so for that reason, it tends to be easier to control and contain than asbestos, but that's probably just more my optimism shining through too. So strategies to avoid lead abatement. One of them, like I said, is using the RRP rule. So then that way you don't have to do full-blown abatement. That is a strategy, and there's a ton of contractors out there who employ that strategy every day. And then just like asbestos abatement, there are encapsulating methods that you can use to go ahead and avoid having to remove lead. Anything else to add, Brad?
No, I think the most common thing is either abate it, or if it's in somewhat good condition, you can encapsulate it and just seal it over.
All right, next topic of conversation and for indoor air quality is mold growth. And I know you have just a depth of knowledge on mold growth. From my perspective, I'll take ownership. I created this slide and Brad endorsed it. But the top 5 scenarios causing mold growth: leaky failing pipes. We see a lot of issues with fiberglass lined AC ducts. And then lack of use or cleanliness of the space, particularly now where there's a ton of unoccupied space, hotel rooms, commercial spaces. Just because nobody's in there and everybody's trying to save money and they turn off the air conditioning, we're actually seeing surface growth in a lot of those spaces and getting calls to come and perform mold remediation there. Improper use of vapor barriers. I think the way that vapor barriers get installed in the mainland, it's almost the opposite out here, and maybe I'll let you speak to that, Brad. And then also construction defects. Just the way things get put together, we see a lot of issues. Anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I would use, as part of construction defects, I would say that would be improper ventilation, either undersized piping to fan coils or air handling units, or chilled water temperature not being the correct temperatures, the cooling coils not having enough rows to dehumidify. I mean, like I said, we've been in Hawaii for 15 years. The vast majority of my work in Hawaii has been due to ventilation systems.
Yeah, and I would agree. AC tends to give us some problems too. When should you be testing, Brad?
Well, that's always a tricky thing when it comes to mold, because mold testing can get expensive, and it's not always going to give you, the yes or no answer. When you're dealing with lead or asbestos, it's either yes, there is lead, or no, there isn't, or yes, there's some asbestos. And then sometimes, depending on the sampling, you're going to get like these gray issues where there's some molds here, but what types of molds there are and the amounts of mold that are present, you may have a problem, you may not. And that's a big issue for someone who is trying to determine whether they have to do something. If you don't see mold, but you've had an inspection and you still there's an odor, there's a complaint, someone's not feeling well, there's irritation, that is when I would suggest, okay, let's look into doing some air sampling. And you're gonna have to do a decent amount of air sampling depending on the size of the area to determine if there is a problem. And when I say a decent amount, I like to space my air sampling out in duplicates. So if it's office A has a problem, I would like to sample office A, B, and maybe C, plus the outdoors, do a round of that, and then wait about an hour or two, see if we can get a couple of air changes, and then do the same round of air sampling. Understanding that that's going to be time consuming and costly, but in my opinion, in some of the guidelines that have been published and established, that's probably one of the better ways to do air sampling. The other is if you're asked to by insurance companies or legal purposes, to document that, yes, it is indeed mold growth that we're dealing with. One of the other good times to do either air sampling and or surface sampling is after a mold remediation project and prior to reoccupancy. I tend to like to do surface sampling on building materials that have been remediated to make sure that Anthony and his crew didn't mess up or skip any steps. So that gives me a good idea of how thoroughly things were cleaned, and that is done prior to reconstruction and occupancy. But that gives you the best idea of when these building materials are basically in raw shape or raw condition, if they are clean and suitable for reconstruction. And those are pretty much that's my thumbnail on air sampling. I can go on and on, but it'll bore you to death.
Are there any any regulations regarding mold and mold testing?
No,
I know there's standards, but
there are no standards. There are a few states that regulate, Texas and Florida being two most common, and I guess New York City does as well. That you have to be a licensed mold inspector or abatement contractor, but as far as like standards and PDLs and anything of that nature for bioaerosols, no, there isn't. There has never been, and I doubt there ever will be.
Yeah, and I'll say from the perspective of an organization that takes a great deal of pride in the amount of training that we provide for our technicians. This is one of the areas that we do that you don't have to have. There's nobody saying you have to have this training in order to do this business. You can literally just open a mold remediation company and go. And so I know whenever we get competing bids and stuff like that, my first question is always like, okay, well, do they have the appropriate credentials? Because that will indicate whether or not they're performing the appropriate scope of work. Unlike lead and asbestos, there is no DOH notification. There's no concerns with manifest waste disposal. A lot of the times there's kind of just a little bit more Wild West, in my opinion. Internally at Premier, we have a policy that if we're doing a mold remediation project, that waste is either placed inside of a sealed dumpster or in a secured area, or a majority of the time, particularly on our service level stuff, we haul all the waste away with us daily just to make sure that nobody's doing dumpster diving and we don't have any exposure and our customers don't have any exposure from that. Anything to add?
Yeah, I would add that since there are very little or no regulations on this, that if you're involved in a mold complaint project, remediation, whatnot, you keep great notes and documentation. I can't tell you how many lawsuits and I've been involved in where simple documents would have really benefited either the building owner, the management company, and saved them thousands of dollars.
Right on. Strategies to avoid mold growth. From my perspective, maintaining the correct temperature and humidity is key. So then that way you never create an environment where condensation can occur. We see a lot of mechanical systems that are, just not serviced regularly. And so condensate lines from backup, the test and balance of them's off. There's a number of things that can come from lack of service. Bottom left is clearing your pipes and inspecting your pipes. There's a lot of cast iron pipes in Hawaii that run vertically, and a lot of that infrastructure is starting to age out. And so those cast iron elbows are starting to rust out. And then just general cleanliness. We have a lot of high humidity environments, and even though you may not have a water incident, it's possible for mold to grow on biofilm in soil that accumulates on the surface of things, and simply keeping them clean a lot of the times will prevent mold growth. And then Brad, we just had Lily ask a question. Are there certain environments or climates that are more prone to mold? I'll let you answer that as well as give your strategies.
Yeah, Hawaii, tropical environment. You know, a lot of our work or my work is in tropical environments. I shockingly have not done many projects in Minnesota or areas where they're persistently getting freeze-thaw cycles. Tropical climates that have high levels of relative humidity, and you never have a let's call it a winter where you freeze the soil and or go through a cycle like that, is when your ambient mold spore concentration on a daily level is pretty consistent in Hawaii, South Florida, areas of that nature. So yeah, those environments are prone to have high levels of mold and outbreaks of mold growth in buildings.
Right on. And I'll speak, Lily, from a more local perspective. So I have two answers for you. The first of which is windward side of most of our islands, you tend to have more environmentally related mold issues just because you hit dew point more frequently, as well as any building or space with air conditioning is just because of the nature of that, where you can hit that point of condensation more readily. We see mold growth in those environments as well. That single wall house in Eva just never seems to grow mold as long as they don't put AC in it. It never seems to have an issue. All right, next I'm going to let next three slides are on Legionella, and this is a topic of conversation that Brad and I have engaged in more recently than ever. And I don't know a ton about Legionella. Brad is our subject matter expert, so I'm going to let you run the next three slides, man.
Sure. So Legionella is basically just a bacteria. It's commonly found in open waters, rivers, streams, lakes, not necessarily much as oceans, but it is a bacteria that loves to grow on biofilms that form in either stagnant waters or building pipes that have not been regulated, treated very well. Legionella can lead to death. Legionella pneumophila serotype 1, you may have heard of Legionnaire's disease, from the mysterious disease. I think it was in the 1960s, when a lot of the Legionnaires or veterans had met in a hotel, and 40 some that died. So Legionella's disease or Legionella is getting more and more attention in the last few years, because cases have been diagnosed about 55% higher each year for the last 3 or 4 years. And let me give you symptoms of Legionnaire's disease and even Pontiac fever. Severe headaches, persistent cough, lack of focus, and overall tiredness. Does that sound like any other symptoms that the current population may be alarmed by?
It sounds like some COVID symptoms to me.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what a big concern is moving forward. So I'm going to go ahead and go to the next slide. So really, like, what do we do here? I don't know, Anthony, if you want to do any of the test on, or talk about any of this, but I can go ahead and take it if you want.
Yeah, take it, man.
Yeah, so really what you're going to look for is go through your buildings and identify control points where you're letting water out, where you're aerosolizing water, and determine if these are acceptable or unacceptable conditions. How do you do that? Well, you look at it, first of all, is the faucet rusty? Does it look like it's been bad? Turn the water on. What does the water look like? Take the temperature. If the temperature is about, if the hot water temperature is about 95 to 100 degrees, well, you're in some risky waters right there, because that's where Legionella loves to grow at that particular time. Then you can see if you can actually test the water and see if you find any disinfectant in the water. Do you see any chlorine or any other building chemicals or chemicals that have been added to the water system? Are they present? If not, then you can go and do a dip slide and see if you have just regular bacteria. And that's a quick, easy test that most engineers can do. And then if you're getting check marks next to some of these, that's when you're going to want to actually do some Legionella testing. And that's from hot water systems, and typically hot water systems that aerosolize, or water features, fountains or whatnot that you'll have at a hotel or in a lobby. Most buildings have removed a lot of that, but if they're still there, those are all prime areas for Legionella outbreaks. Air sampling for Legionella is almost never done. I've only seen it done once in my lifetime. Next slide. So really this all boils down to what do you do, how do you do it, and how do we control it? So really the last capitalized bullet point down there is have a water management program. That's CDC and ASHRAE combined are recommending that, and that's your first line of defense excuse me, for controlling Legionella. You can go through your building and do what we did before, is do check marks and stuff of that nature. The easiest way to control it is to have a clean building, have your engineers maintaining your hot water system as best they can. If you suspect or have a outbreak and you need to do something, the control measures or the ramifications, remediation of Legionella can be very expensive and difficult. If you can see or know where the source is, you can eliminate the source. So is that a dead leg? Is that a shower head or a couple shower heads? Then you just remove that. If that's the case in your building, go buy a lottery ticket because you got really lucky. If you can eliminate showers. I know there's been some companies that I've worked for that have eliminated public showers prior to COVID even. Or they made the people that wanted those showers to sign a hold harmless release form, simply because they knew at that area they had a very hard time controlling Legionella. Other more expensive and then kind of harder remediation procedures are thermal shock, which you're raising temperatures above 120 degrees, so you're shocking the pipes. The problem is you have to worry about any occupancy then, because for scalding would be a big issue. And then you're starting to get into disinfecting. So you're using chemicals, multiple chemicals usually, to introduce into these pipes, which you have to be very careful because you could potentially corrode the pipes from the inside out. Next slide real quick. So I can't stress the water management plan enough. If you don't have one, consider starting one or getting an idea of how to get one together. In the last 5 or 6 major building transactions and due diligence I've been involved in, this has been one of the big questions. Do you have a water management plan? And if so, can we review it? No one's had one yet. We do develop these we help clients develop them. They can be costly depending on how big your building is, but it's an ASHRAE standard 188. and this is the CDC. It kind of walks you through on how to develop one.
Thanks, Brad. And just my question is, with the low occupancy or lack of occupancy both in the hospitality and commercial spaces right now, why are you particularly concerned about Legionella?
It's the stagnant water.
Yeah.
You know, I literally just reviewed some results that were taken a couple of weeks ago from an office building, and they claim that they were flushing their system. They're getting ready to reoccupy or partially reoccupy some floors. They've had some concerns of Legionella in the past that have not been, there hasn't been much Legionella, but they've had the bacteria present. We got the results back, and it's overloaded some of the plates. That's how bad it is.
Oh, wow. Crazy. All right. And then our last indoor air quality concern, we would be remiss if we didn't have at least a couple slides on COVID. Like I said, I've done so many COVID presentations, and I know everybody here has probably been through enough. So we're just going to buzz through these, but feel free to drop something in the chat if you're like, wait, slow down. What did you just say? Or I've got a question. So I'll speak to my side, and then Brad, obviously you provide a little bit more of a national perspective. So we look at COVID and we go, hey, we've got 3 different types of responses that we're being called and asked to do, and knowing which one it is helps us develop the plan on how that person who's managing that facility should respond. So from actual exposure incidents where you have somebody who is confirmed and you knew they were in the space for a given period of time, to presumed exposure incidents where you're not really sure, somebody's awaiting a test, or, a number of different scenarios. And then we're getting a lot of phone calls, particularly now for forward-looking, like preventative training aspects, where folks are asking, I know I'm going to have this problem to deal with. What can I do to stay ahead of it? One of the things that we did is we created a program called Clean and Safe, where we'll come in, we'll clean your facility and everything. But the bigger component of that is doing some training, some baseline training with all the staff who maintain that property, and then developing a set of guidelines that is in adherence with the CDC guidelines that are specific to the property, drilling it down to key touch points, that kind of stuff. And we've done this a lot with, condo associations, preschools, a number of facilities that are essential and cannot close. And it really helps provide peace of mind. And this is the work I'd rather do. The actual exposure and confirmed stuff, that's kind of that. I'd rather not do that. I'd rather just make sure that we keep everybody safe. Anything to add, Brad?
No.
All right, testing. So Brad and I had a wonderful conversation back in March on testing that I learned a lot from. What's your position on COVID testing and sampling?
Don't do it.
Tell me why.
It's so expensive, and unless you get rapid results, let's just call it the viability of the virus will most likely, if not completely, die off before you get results, making the test irrelevant. The PCR testing is fine, but as we're seeing, the virus is mutated a lot since we first saw it in Seattle. So even the PCR is kind of not 100% accurate, as of recent studies suggest. So really, if you were to have an outbreak in your building, what I suggest and what we have done is, there's a company like Premier comes in and does some cleaning, and then what we look for is simply dust. And if we find dust or can grab dust off a surface or whatnot, well, we know they didn't do a very good job cleaning, because guess what? The virus is going to adhere to dust. It's not going to want to sit on a very clean surface for very long. It can't. it's way too light. Typical airflow or air movement will make it fall to the ground or whatnot. So that's what we do as far as testing is actually just test for dust, for cleanliness, after you've had an outbreak or you suspect an outbreak or whatnot, and you've had cleaning done. That's just our kind of philosophy on it right now.
And I would agree. When we're working with facility managers on, kind of a response plan, one of the questions I always ask them is, okay, if you did have an exposure, how long can you close the space, right? And if you can close the space for an extended amount of time, all the science says that the viability of the virus, cycles down pretty quickly. And if you just don't occupy it, your problem goes away.
Right.
Strategies for avoiding exposure. So I broke up the strategy slide into two different slides. So the first one being how to avoid exposure. Having a safety policy, like this is our premier internal safety policy. This is what our technicians adhere to and do on every single job site and every single day. And if one of my technicians has to hear me talk about how they need to wear their mask one more time, I'm probably going to get punched, but I don't care. I want our guys to go home safe. And then the other thing that is been a comment, like almost a nuisance, and it really bugs me, is a lack of focus on how cleaning and disinfecting are two completely independent steps. There's a lot of focus on the disinfecting side, but the reality is if you apply a disinfectant to a surface and that surface is dirty, you can't effectively disinfect that surface. Anything to add, Brad?
No, that's good.
Right on. And then kind of strategies for reducing cost if exposed. Kind of the slide one in the upper left is the New England Journal of Medicine study on the viability of the virus on various surfaces. And just kind of speaking to the fact that, if you can not occupy the space for a period of time, you can kind of justify not doing cleaning. Now, that doesn't necessarily deal with the perception of people coming in to reoccupy a space that may have soil on it, but the science supports that. And then for that reason, we kind of looked at our cleaning approach and said, hey, what can we provide multiple tiers of cleaning to our customers so that way we can match the severity. And so if you're saying, hey, look, I don't know, I just want to have somebody come in and clean my lobby, we're probably going to recommend tier 1, because it's going to be the most cost effective. Whereas if you had a confirmed case and that person sat in that room for 8 hours, we're going to recommend tier 3. Anything else, Brad?
Well, that's a good approach.
Right on. All right. So that concludes our presentation today. I'll hand it back over to Holly. And thank you, everybody, for sitting and letting us run 6 minutes over. I sincerely appreciate that. And then if there are any questions, feel free to follow up directly with us. And then don't forget to hit up Kira. I will echo what Kira said, those Tory Richards face masks, I've got 2 of them. And they're the ones that sit in the pocket of my truck, so I can throw one on when they go to Safeway just because they're so comfy.
Thank you, Anthony and Brad. This concludes today's program on indoor air quality, brought to you by BOMA Hawaii's August Platinum sponsor, Premier Restoration Hawaii. Correction to the email for Kira for your complimentary gift, please email her at kera@premhi.com. It's also in the chat room. And thank you to Anthony and Brad for taking the time to share with us this valuable information. Last but not least, thank you to everyone who attended today's webinar. Please visit our website, bomahawaii.com, for upcoming events and our special membership package for new members. Thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thanks again, Holly. Take care, everybody.
You're welcome. Take care, everyone.